Howdy, y'all, welcome back. As the ancient legend goes, King Solomon, leaving his vast kingdom in Jerusalem, then settled somewhere in Africa. The entirety of this continent, known colloquially until the 19th century as Ethiopia. Solomon was said to have settled in this region with the Queen of Sheba. Up until roughly the 18th century, the ocean that we know today as the Atlantic was referred to in many sources as the Ethiopian Ocean. Along the way, as far as the history goes, we have what is considered to be one of the most vast constructions erected in Africa, which defined, and for many redefined, the understanding of African architecture pre-European settlers to the area. Furthermore, the history here seems to allude to a conspiracy of the highest order. Have you ever wondered why, when it comes to the architecture situated in the African continent, most of the information we have today is circumstantial, incomplete, and often appears to discredit the native people of Africa? Oddly, when we head further north into the ancient Berber lands as well as into Egypt and Canaan, we have a well-defined history, one which seems to pinpoint certain leaders, traditions, and narratives which have an astounding resemblance to other more European-centric narratives. When it comes to pure, unfiltered history regarding the greatest constructions of African origin, we find that vast pockets of the history have been watered down or deemed to be unknown. For instance, Prester John is a well-known fable which some deem to have much basis in reality, showcasing factual interpretations. As the story goes, a Christian believer in the very early times fled Europe and landed somewhere in Africa, intermingling with a massive trade system and thus introducing much of the African continent to Christianity for the first time. However, in ancient Ethiopia especially, the lineage and ancestry of the pre-colonization royal native population often intermingles with ancient biblical belief. Up until the end of the 19th century, the rulers of Ethiopia traced their lineage directly back to King Solomon and claimed so in their titles. Furthermore, what fascinates me the most about the Prester John legend, never mind the concept of the phantom 1,000 years, we still have an indication that Prester John somehow became a benefactor not only of the richest gold and gem deposits in the world, which occurred in Africa, but of the influence which this gold trade and the monopoly the kingdoms of Africa had on it could create. Many have begun to question if the mythical King Solomon, Queen of Sheba, Prester John, and the known leader Mansa Musa could not have all been purposefully interwoven into the African mythology, which shaped large portions of this history and was presented post-colonization. In today's photographs, as you can see from the labels, we will be focusing on the ancient, fortified, and ruined city of Zimbabwe, the fort for which the African country takes its name. Now, I will not get too deep into the narrative regarding this construction, because to adhere to one narrative would be to discredit the current one, which essentially says the construction of this epic fortified location is mostly unknown. What we do know, and I'm so dumbfounded by this, is that the entirety of this complex was built using stones and zero mortar. There is nothing holding this entire complex together besides the intricate construction and the weight of the stones themselves. Furthermore, Fort Zimbabwe is the largest pre-colonization fortification that exists in all of Africa. To make matters more complicated, the history of Fort Zimbabwe has purposefully been hidden, rewritten, and mistaken for centuries by the various governments who claimed this ancient creation. Fort Zimbabwe is better known as Great Zimbabwe. Great Zimbabwe measures nearly 3 square miles and was estimated to house nearly 20,000 people. Modern scholars say that it was created in the 11th century. However, references to the region and the fortification can be traced back to biblical times. The original walls of Great Zimbabwe stood at 36 feet high or taller, and many still stand to that height in some locations today. Again, this entire complex is dry stone, or stone that was constructed without mortar. Diving into this further, from its first discovery by European settlers in 1506, the history of Fort Zimbabwe is obscure at best. Diego de Alcacova describes the site as in ruins in 1506, yet fully occupied by the Ukalanga people. The Portuguese historian de Barros describes Great Zimbabwe in 1538 as the greatest ruin found so far in Africa, but also describes the landscape as barren of occupation. He calls the location Simba or Simbal, meaning what he calls the royal court. Here, we can almost instantly see how Europeans attempted to discredit the African construction, as de Barros also describes the native Shona people who lived outside the ruins of Great Zimbabwe as incapable of creating such a lavish fortification, and de Barros claims the Shona people said Great Zimbabwe was, quote, built by the devils, end quote. At the same time, seemingly contradicting himself, de Barros, in his 1538 account, also claims that the ruins of Zimbabwe Fort are run and maintained by the Simba Kayo, a noble leader who occupies the ruins with his many wives and the rest of his family. De Barros also admits he had never actually visited Great Zimbabwe, but instead established his account from multiple Moorish traders who knew of the lost gold and fortifications of Great Zimbabwe. Admittedly, it already sounds like very much of this history is conjecture with very little fact. While these two earliest European accounts of Great Zimbabwe are impressive, and looking at the architecture in these photographs, we can only imagine how sprawling this landscape would have looked in the early 1500s. But bearing all that in mind, we're told Great Zimbabwe was never further excavated or explored, at least not documented excavations, and was lost until it was rediscovered over 300 years later in 1867. What a coincidence! What hasn't already been a tale that appears it was pulled from a novel will become one when we discuss how in 1867, nearly 330 years after its last documentation, Great Zimbabwe is rediscovered by Adam Render, a German-American big game hunter. The rediscovery led to fellow German-speaking explorer Karl Mach being the first to excavate the site in 1871. Mach immediately found evidence that suggested to him the site was of Jewish origin, and furthermore could be traced back to the lineage of the Queen of Sheba and possibly King Solomon. Outstandingly, Mach unknowingly confirmed the speculations of the Portuguese explorer de Barros nearly 330 years earlier. Both believed that Great Zimbabwe was of biblical origin and could be traced back to an advanced lineage of people descended directly from the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon. The ruins of Great Zimbabwe contain such luxuries as Lebanese cedar, which Mock believed arrived with the Phoenicians who amalgamated into the Zimbabwe trade kingdom. While these claims have been discredited by modern scholars and any evidence to the contrary has been all but eliminated from modern sources, we still have the documents of Carl Peters, who in 1905 discovered Egyptian cartouches inside Great Zimbabwe, which dated back to the New Kingdom, or nearly 3,500 years ago, making Great Zimbabwe either much older than modern belief or possibly marking the site as a sort of ancient museum, a storage location, or a melting pot for many cultures. Later scholars have established that this ancient Egyptian cartouche was actually from the later Ptolemaic era, or roughly 300 BC. By the early 20th century, the British had begun their journey into deciphering Great Zimbabwe, with historian J. Theodore Bent, aided by Cecil Rhodes, concluding that Great Zimbabwe was built by migrant Phoenicians aided by a local Semitic Arabian workforce. While inconclusive, the British men hypothesized that Fort Zimbabwe could be one of the oldest forts in the entire world, predating written history in Europe and possibly occurring at the time when the phonetic alphabet, a Phoenician creation, was in its earliest stages. Amidst these claims by different European scholars from the 16th century onward, a group of native people of Zimbabwe have continuously claimed ownership and creation of Great Zimbabwe. These people, known as the Lemba, are remarkable for numerous reasons. One, their ancestors, according to the legend, were great men from a secluded island who needed to find gold to survive. Adventuring out on their great boat, a storm then divided the sea, and the men washed ashore in Africa. A blessing, these men then discovered vast pockets of gold and were able to establish a great kingdom there. The kingdom became a fortified mine and trade center. This center was then known as Great Zimbabwe. Somewhat against the mainstream, the Lemba have continued to face backlash for their claims of Middle Eastern ancestry. However, DNA tests conducted throughout recent times have traced a direct lineage between nearly all Lemba people and their paternal root ancestor, who in fact came from the Middle East. Archaeologists now believe the ancient Lemba may have arrived to Africa in search of gold, and using the local populace may have built Great Zimbabwe. The local people, being genetically ancestors of the Shona, would have had large numbers of their people who converted to the Lemba religion, which was distinct as it was pre-Abrahamic yet resembled many Jewish traditions. For example, the Lemba observe the seventh day of rest. The Lemba identify themselves as the chosen people. The Lemba refrain from eating pig and nearly every other beast that is banned in the Torah. The Lemba practice ritual sacrifice of animals and previously of their fellow man, a practice noted as being distinctly ancient Middle Eastern. The Lemba practice snipping of the male parts and are considered to be some of the originators of this practice. Since the early 1900s, the Lemba people have identified their Hebrew origins and include the Star of David on their tombstones and monuments. The Lemba are noted as describing their features as a combination of Queen Sheba and King Solomon, or both Middle Eastern and African, a claim which is proven by their DNA. Diving back into the origins of Great Zimbabwe, by the early to mid-1900s, the British, who seem to have become the experts on the matter, pun intended, claimed that Great Zimbabwe is not only of no relation to King Solomon or any other Jewish population in Africa, but the British also claimed that Great Zimbabwe was built in the Middle Ages, possibly the 12th or 13th century. Interesting, as the fort was lined with numerous artifacts from different cultures of millennia earlier, it's hard to imagine all these artifacts being forgeries or buried in the damaged chambers at a later time. It seems indeed, as with all good mysteries, we have two sides fighting to keep our eyes away from the truth. Now take this all with a grain of salt, but the first European to definitively claim the land of Great Zimbabwe was built by Phoenicians and not Africans was named Cecil Rhodes, and he was British. The landscape, which up until 1980 was known as Rhodesia, benefited enormously from allowing European benefactors to excavate, document, and settle the land, and these, quote, explorers, like Cecil Rhodes, were sent to Great Zimbabwe with an agenda, and that was to not only discredit the possibility of African and Jewish construction, as well as to discredit the biblical ties, but to further suppress the notion that the site was of any importance at all. Thus, through the 1970s, it was illegal to claim Great Zimbabwe was constructed by anyone other than Phoenicians or Arabs. The knowledge that Great Zimbabwe was built using, at least in large portions, the local African populace and the seemingly Jewish origin of these local African architects was suppressed from every history book, news outlet, and to question the Rhodesian official narrative was illegal. Archaeologists who disputed the official statement were censored, banned, and made examples of by the Rhodesian government. In 1980, the new, internationally recognized country formed directly out of reform demand was named Zimbabwe, named after the Great Zimbabwe fortification, which for so many centuries was considered the most historical and extensive in all of Africa. In the early 21st century, the government of Zimbabwe endorsed the creation of a university in the vicinity of the Great Zimbabwe ruins. This university is an arts and culture-based university, which draws from the rich history of the monument. If this isn't proof enough of a seemingly advanced, probably unified, scientifically gifted population in Africa with at least partial roots which mirror the biblical narrative, we also have the word great, as in Great Zimbabwe. In this context and translation, it distinguishes the site from many smaller ruins, also known as Zimbabwes, which are littered across the Zimbabwe highlands. There are at least 200 other unique sites in southern Africa, all employing the dry stone technique. These are massive fortifications, aged significantly, seemingly from before a cataclysm, which have stood the test of time, all being built without any mortar or any other material to hold them together. These are the original masterpieces, possibly extending further into the ground, as it's been proven at least a handful of these ancient Zimbabwes, including Great Zimbabwe, also served as trade centers and mines for collecting gold, silver, and other gems. This gold, the mines, and the trade centers played a key role in the greatest legends of Africa, including Mansa Musa. These ancient trade routes and the desire for gold may have also been a backdoor route for which the European could have exploited the copious amounts of gold in Africa, thus cementing the legend of Prester John, of Queen Sheba and King Solomon, of Mansa Musa, all the while quietly removing the historic artifacts in secret. A passionate people with DNA tied to the Middle East, descendants of Solomon and of Sheba. As we read of Great Zimbabwe and the mythology, we note the key component to the story of Prester John was his ability to reach the many kingdoms of Africa. Nothing would make this easier than the trade routes that were established in and around the most profitable locations in ancient Africa, the Zimbabwes, the ancient mines and trade centers which surrounded them. Great Zimbabwe was the epicenter for something greater, an achievement in not only architecture, but of biblical proportions, a precursor to mythical tales told during a time lost. But through these photographs, you can decide what you believe the history of Great Zimbabwe truly is.